The Senate is currently in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to a quorum call be suspended and that I be...
Without objection, so ordered.
And I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to engage in colloquy with my colleague from Arizona.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there's been a lot of conversation about the issue of illegal immigration, the results of different meetings. I know that my colleague from Arizona would like to discuss that aspect of the issue, but I take the floor with my friend and leader from Arizona to discuss the overall issue of immigration in light of a meeting and a trip that he and I had to the border on Saturday, where we visited with ranchers, with citizens, with Border Patrol, and had a thorough trip throughout the area. And we come to the floor to share our conclusions and concerns with our colleagues. So let me begin by saying unfortunately or fortunately, the head of the Customs and Border Patrol recently said that Arizona, parts of Arizona were like a, quote, third world country. And you know, in some respects, he may have been correct. I quote him. It is Aguilar, David Aguilar, Deputy Commissioner for Customs and Border Protection, was quoted in the Arizona Republic as saying that the border is not a fence or a line in the dirt, but a broad and complex corridor. It is, I quote, Aguilar explained, a third country that joins Mexico and the United States. A third country that joins Mexico and the United States is obviously not as secure as the United States of America. If my colleagues would look at this map here, you'll see this area there, and this is the sign. This is the sign that's posted as far away as 50 miles from the Arizona-Mexico border. My colleagues can see it. Danger, public warning, travel not recommended, active drug and human smuggling area. Visitors may encounter armed criminals and smuggling vehicles traveling at high rates of speed. Stay away from trash, clothing, backpacks, and abandoned vehicles. If you see suspicious activity, do not confront. Move away and call 911. BLM encourages visitors to use public lands north of Interstate 8. North. Interstate 8 is the area that is north of the shaded area. In other words, visitors are encouraged not to go south of the interstate, which is a huge part of the state of Arizona. That's what's posted sign by the federal government. And then the Director of Homeland Security, the Secretary of Homeland Security says, quote, the border is secure as ever. If the border is as secure as ever, then you either draw the conclusions that it wasn't secure, because you wouldn't have to be posting signs like this 50 miles north of the border if the border was secure. Our whole point is we need to get the border secure. We don't see the necessity in the United States of America for a sign like that. I'd like to put up the other sign if we would. So why, if we're doing fine on border security, would it be necessary to put up a sign like that all the way up to the interstate? Here's another sign. This is in the Coronado National Forest. Right? We'll put the one up in the Coronado National Forest. This is in our national forest. It's from the Park Service. Smuggling and or illegal entry is common in this area due to the proximity of the international border. Why would we have, if we had a secure border, why would we have to put up signs like that? If we've made such great progress that the Secretary of Homeland Security is trumpeting, put up the other one then. Why in the world would we have to put up signs like that? That's the question. So I'll let my colleague discuss the results of our visit but I can tell you that the citizens residing in the southern part of our state do not feel secure. When you have 241,000 illegal immigrants apprehended last year, that means that, depending on who you talk to, it's nearly 1 million people are apprehended in just that part of the border. When you have 1.2 million pounds of marijuana intercepted just in the Tucson sector, it is not a secure border. When you have the violence, the incredible violence that continues to rise on the other side of the border, you know it is a matter of time before it spills onto our side of the border. Unfortunately, just south of the Arizona-Sonora border resides the most vicious of all the drug cartels, the Sinaloa drug cartel, headed by a guy named Chapo Guzman, who walked out of a Mexican prison a few years ago, and unfortunately they have corrupted officials up to very high levels. So I report to my colleagues that the people living in the southern part of the state of Arizona do not feel secure. They see signs such as this one that I just mentioned. They see the destruction of our wildlife preserves. They see the home invasions. And yes, our Border Patrol and the men and women who are serving in it are doing a magnificent job. We're proud of the job they're doing, but they don't have the assets in order to complete the job of securing our border. Senator Kyle and I have a 10-point plan that, if implemented, will do the job.
Mr. President, the stories that we heard were human tragedies, and statistics don't tell the story adequately. Let me cite a few of the statistics and then ask my colleague to recount some of the really heart-rending stories that we heard from families in the area. And when we talk about that, he can point to the extreme southeast corner of the state of Arizona, where primarily we were on Saturday and where most of these folks live, on ranches, places that used to be very safe, but which today they don't feel that they can sleep at night or move around without carrying weapons. They need to travel in pairs. This is the area in which an extraordinarily difficult tragedy occurred when a longtime resident of the area was slain, we believe by, or it is believed by, one of the drug cartel or other smugglers that frequent the area. And the human tragedy is the real heart of this. But let me just cite some statistics, because when the Secretary of Homeland Security says that we're as secure as we've ever been, I think these statistics would at least belie part of that claim. About 50% of all illegal immigrants enter through Arizona. In fact, they enter through essentially the eastern 1/3 of that particular map. The number of illegal immigrants living in Arizona increased over the last decade about twice, up to over 600,000 people. It's estimated that about 12% of Arizona's workers are illegal immigrants. According to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, about 12% of the county's population, but 22% of felony crimes are committed by illegal immigrants. My colleague has talked frequently about the fact that Phoenix, Arizona, our hometown, is the second largest kidnapping capital of the world and the largest in the United States, second in the world only to Mexico City. We can go on and on about the statistics. We have the highest rate of property crime among the 50 states in the last year, for which the FBI reported the statistics, 2008. Our sheriffs and other law enforcement tell us that between 15 and 20% of the individuals apprehended at the border have criminal records or are wanted for crimes in the United States. Phoenix is a primary originating city where drugs are brought from the border, held in Phoenix, and then transported to other cities. We lead the nation in marijuana seizures, 50% of all marijuana seizures. Heroin is increasingly found in Arizona, and on and on and on. The statistics don't lie, of course, but the real tragedy is the human tragedy, the fear that people have, people who are fourth or fifth generation ranch families in the area. people in town who increasingly are the subject of break-ins and property crimes and the like. And none of this even begins to talk about what happens when the people who are smuggled into the country are held in drop houses, generally in the Phoenix area, for transport either west to Las Vegas or Los Angeles rather, or east to where east in the country. They're essentially victimized by the very people who smuggled them in, who demand ransom from their families in Mexico or El Salvador or Guatemala or wherever they might have come from. And until they pay that ransom, they are brutalized and assaulted and become victims of crime themselves, and of course rarely report that crime. So the human tragedy here is the real story, but it is important, I think, for us to at least cite the statistics and show our colleagues the signs that the United States government itself feels constrained to post in order to warn people to stay out of an area which encompasses probably about 20% of the state of Arizona.
And could I also make comment that my colleague from Arizona points out the terrible and unspeakable treatment that is inflicted upon these individuals, which are brought up by human smugglers, and almost all of them are brought up by human smugglers. Where are the human rights advocates and activists? Shouldn't they be standing up and saying, we got to have a secure border so that these unspeakable indignities and rape and ransom and all these things, shouldn't that be stopped with a secure border? The second thing I'd like to point out very quickly to my colleague and to my colleagues, in recent years, 80% of the wildfires in our Coronado National Forest have been human-caused. 75% of those are attributed to undocumented aliens that failed to properly extinguish fires, started to signal for rides, cook food, or dry clothing. The Coronado National Forest now has to send armed officers to clear wildland fire areas and to provide security for firefighters. The Forest Service has reported accounts of armed smugglers walking through the middle of active firefighting operations. And now in its fourth week, today as we speak, the human-caused horseshoe fire is burning in the Chiricahua Mountains in the Coronado National Forest, 5 miles from the town of Portal, Arizona. It's a very heavy drug trafficking and border crossing activity. But I'd like to just, in the few minutes we have remaining, engage Senator Kyle in a conversation about what we need to do and why we need to secure the border first. There's been a lot of publicity in the last 24 hours about a conversation that Senator Kyle had with the President of the United States. I was not there, but I was there a few weeks ago when the President of the United States came and had lunch with the Republican senators, gave a list of the issues that he was concerned about, and immigration was one of the items that he mentioned. So I and Senator Kyle responded to the President of the United States. It was made very clear to me in the conversation we had, and I'm sure our 39 other colleagues who were there, that the President basically conditioned his support for border security to overall comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, we went back and forth. I tried to explain to the President that we gave amnesty back in the 1980s. Somewhere around 3 million illegal immigrants were given amnesty, but the promise was we'd secure the border. Obviously, we didn't secure the border. We now have 12 million people in this country. As Senator Kyle mentioned, some hundreds of thousands in the state of Arizona illegally. So, our point is that even if we went through comprehensive immigration reform, if we didn't have a secure border, then sometime from now, we would have another group of illegal immigrants that we would have to address the issue, which argues for getting the border secured first. It can be done in a year to 2 years. It isn't that expensive when you look at the costs of a wildfire and all of the things and the drugs and everything else that is associated with it, not to mention the violation of human rights. So there's a big stir about a conversation the President and Senator Kyle had. It was clear to me in the conversation in front of 39 Republican senators that the President of the United States said, yes, he would secure the border, but we had to have, quote, comprehensive immigration reform. This is the difference between our position and that of the President. We say secure the borders. Have the governors of the border states certify that it's secured, and then we can certainly move on. But the American people have to have the assurance that we're not going to revisit this issue time after time after time. And every nation has the obligation to secure its borders. So,
President, when Senator McCain and I asked the acting head of the Border Patrol in the area where we were on Saturday, what do you need? He basically said, more of everything. He talked about the need for 800 more Border Patrol agents. He talked about the need for more surveillance, something that Senator McCain has talked about a lot. Surveillance to cover a very big area that you're probably never going to have enough personnel, even if we bring National Guard troops. He welcomed the National Guard troops to the area. He said, we're going to have consequences for people crossing. I talked to him about Operation Streamline. In the Yuma sector of the border, which is on the western part of the Arizona border, the Yuma sector is very close to being operationally clear of illegal immigration issues because they have enough agents, they have enough fencing, and by the way, he talked about the need to repair and replace a lot of the fencing in his sector, but they also have a policy that instead of catch and release, where the people are simply put on a bus and sent back to Mexico, they actually are prosecuted and have to spend at least 2 weeks in jail. That's a huge deterrent, because if you're a criminal, obviously you don't want to be caught and go to jail. And if you're just here to work, make money, and send back to your family, you're obviously not able to do that if you spend time in jail. So he said there have to be consequences. And we believe that the expenditure of somewhere between $1 billion and $3 billion over the next couple of years could provide adequate resources. This is our 10-point plan. Adequate personnel, the fencing that's required, the surveillance, the technology, and also the extra prosecutors, courtroom, and detention spaces that would be necessary to provide the deterrent or the consequences, as he put it. So there's no doubt that the border can be secured. What we need is the will to do it.
And what Senator KYL and I are trying to report to our colleagues: one, the border is not secure. The border is not secure. Two, it can be secure. And once how could someone claim that our border is more secure than ever if the federal government has to put up that kind of warning to American citizens on American soil? I mean, if nothing would convince my colleagues that we need to do a lot more, it's the actions of the federal government. That's not a private landowner that put up that sign. That's the Bureau of Land Management. And so has the Department of Interior and other agencies. So the point is that we're trying to tell our colleagues that it's not secure, we can secure it, and our citizens deserve that. But the second point is that we want to make as forcefully as possible. Let's get this border secure, which we can do, and then we can move forward with comprehensive immigration reform and work together with our colleagues on the other side to the American people and say, hey, we've moved forward with this legislation, but yet we're still having to put up signs like this that people should avoid, that they're in an active drug and human smuggling area in the United States of America, is not a convincing argument that there are, quote, as secure as ever.
Might I inquire how much time remains on our side?
6 minutes, 18 seconds.
That's the time remaining on our side. All right.
That's correct.
Good. Then, Mr. President, what I would like to do is take about 3 more minutes, and then my colleague can close. As he said, if you need a different kind of reason to want to secure the border, then look at what's happening to our environment. I know the presiding officer and his father before him are keen on protecting the great national treasures of our country, our environment. And coming from adjoining states, we share a lot of the same kind of country. And the area in the extreme southwestern part of his state and the extreme southeastern part of our state is known for some of the best birding in the world. And the part of northern Mexico that borders our states provides a sanctuary for birds that are not found anywhere else in the world. And this fire that my colleague mentioned is burning right up to the creek, which is one of the watersheds that represents the prime area for these birds to exist. Their habitat will be destroyed if we continue to have fires set by illegal immigrants in the area that destroy the habitat. If you look at the environment of the area from the air, you see that there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of paths that are worn in parts of the desert that are basically off limits to American citizens and even to our law enforcement officials. But the smugglers use these trails and they deposit their trash. And everybody knows that once you have cut the desert, it takes hundreds of years for that desert to respond. That's just one reason. Obviously, the human tragedy is the one that is most concerned. And if my colleagues would just hear this one plaintive cry, we were told on numerous occasions on Saturday, please go back to Washington and tell your colleagues what it's like. Tell them how we are suffering. Tell them what we have to go through just to live here. Can't our government at least provide basic protection from crime? And these are members of the family of Rob Krentz, who was brutally gunned down, fellow ranchers in the area, and other citizens who live in the small communities there. They believe that their government has abandoned them. And they look right into our eyes and say, what are you going to do about it? And the best that we can do is to tell you the fear that they have, the suffering that they've gone through, the difficulty that they have continuing to live in an area, as I said, in which some of their families have lived for 4 or 5 generations. To pass that message on to my colleagues and say, okay, if it's the environment you care about, there's a reason to be there. If it's crime, there's a huge reason to be there. If it's the cost to the state and federal government, we need to get a hold of this problem. But if you just care about the people who are there, we have an obligation as their representatives to help ensure their protection. And that's the message we're coming to the floor here today to convey to our colleagues. Please listen, if not to us, to our constituents. And remember that we all work for all of the people of the United States of America. We are all United States senators. And so every one of us here has an obligation to the folks, yes, in your state, but also to the folks in our state, to at least provide them the basic protection and give them a sense that they don't live in a third world country between the United States and Mexico, that they are American citizens deserving of the protection of the United States government.
Mr. President, there's no way I can elaborate on that very strong statement, so I yield the balance of our time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wanted to rise today in support of S. 1237.